Hello, friends. Welcome to Soft History Stories. Have you ever wondered about real life in a medieval tavern? Picture this. You step through the heavy wooden doors of a medieval tavern, and immediately you're hit with the thick, pungent scent of ale, sweat, and smoke. The air, heavy and warm, clings to you as you step into the chaos. The flickering light from a few scattered candles and the crackling fire cast erratic shadows across the room, illuminating the rough stone walls and worn wooden furniture. The low ceiling feels oppressive, and the dirt floors are a patchwork of spills, mud, and crumbs from countless meals consumed over the years. The noise is constant, a mix of hearty laughter, shouting, and the clinking of mugs and plates. Here, peasants huddle together at tables, speaking in low voices, while the occasional knight or traveling merchant speaks loudly, recounting tales of distant lands. The air vibrates with the pulse of everyday life that flows through these establishments. People come here not just for drink, but for something more: camaraderie, gossip, and, sometimes, a fleeting escape from the grim realities of medieval life. But don't mistake this place for the cozy pubs of today. This is no place for relaxation after a hard day's work. Here, survival is the real game. The chances of leaving unscathed are slim, and for many, a visit to the tavern didn't end as peacefully as it began. Illness, violence, and danger lurked in every corner, and the tavern was as much a part of the struggle for survival as the fields and markets outside. For many, the tavern was a world of uncertainty and unpredictable, sometimes deadly place that could turn from jovial to tragic in an instant. Tonight, we take a journey back in time, a journey into a world where the medieval tavern wasn't just a place to grab a drink, but a stage where survival depended on more than luck. A place where people, bound by harsh laws and scarce resources, mingled in a strange and perilous atmosphere. This wasn't a place of comfort or relaxation, it was a battlefield where the stakes were high and the risks were everywhere. Let's take a quiet journey through the strange and perilous world of medieval taverns. Here, every drink, every word, and every fight could mean the difference between life and death. The rules of the tavern were as harsh as the world outside, and the people who frequented these spaces knew that survival meant more than just keeping a full mug. So, lie back, close your eyes, and let the sounds of history wash over you as we unravel the strange and often dangerous truths behind the medieval tavern. The dimly lit tavern, with its low beams and smoke-saturated air, was not a place for the weary to rest or the noble to relax. In fact, it was a far cry from the cozy hearths and soft cushions you might imagine when thinking of a retreat from the biting cold. Instead, the tavern was a swirling tempest of noise, heat, and often chaos, a living, breathing entity of its own, throbbing with the energy of those who enter. The pungent odor of damp wool, sweat, and spilled ale clung to the air, while the light of a dozen flickering candles cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. And in this place, far from the comforts of a proper home, the common folk of medieval life gathered: farmers, craftsmen, and traders, their hands rough from labor, their faces marked by the hardships of a life spent in the dirt and the elements, came together in this space to seek relief from the daily grind. The tavern was their haven, their meeting ground, a place where stories were exchanged, laughter echoed off the walls, and the lines between the sacred and the profane blurred in a haze of alcohol and wild energy. But it was not only stories that flowed freely in the tavern. So too did the ale, cheap and plentiful, poured from kegs that seemed never to run dry. It was the currency of the common man, the glue that bound this chaotic assembly of souls together. A man's worth could often be measured by how many pints he could down before stumbling into a heap, and those who could hold their drink were respected. But for all its warmth, the tavern was a dangerous place, where the thin veil of civility could be torn apart by a single wrong word or a slight misunderstood. Picture the scene. A group of rowdy farmers, still covered in the dust and mud of the fields, gathering around a wooden table with their hands wrapped around mugs that sloshed with the golden liquid of the local brew. The conversation starts light, the kind of banter that comes easily after a long day's work. It's about the harvest, the weather, maybe a joke about a neighboring village. But soon, the volume rises, laughter turning to raucous guffaws. Each man is trying to outdo the other in a game of wit, throwing out insults that cut deeper than the words would suggest. At some point, a joke crosses the line, perhaps one too sharp for someone's pride, and just like that, the atmosphere shifts. A glance, a hand raised in defense, and suddenly the room erupts. A drunken brawl starts over nothing more than a careless remark. Fists fly through the air, clumsy but forceful, colliding with faces and the hardwood of the table. Chairs scrape back, sending the remains of half-eaten bread and cheese skittering across the floor. A tankard goes flying, its contents spilling like a river across the floorboards, mixing with the dirt and the spilt blood. In these moments, the tavern's charm of camaraderie disappears, replaced by raw, primal energy. The laughter becomes the desperate, guttural sounds of men fighting for pride, for dominance, for something far deeper than mere drunkenness. Yet this chaos was far from rare. It was the heartbeat of tavern life. Every corner, every crevice of the room had witnessed countless such scenes. And though these events could leave the evening battered and broken, it would not be long before another round of drinks was served, and the process began again. For the men who walked into that tavern, no matter how many bruises or cuts they left with, the camaraderie of shared hardship was often worth the pain. After all, what was a black eye when you could say you'd fought for your place in the world, even if only over a scrap of bread and a badly timed joke? But it wasn't just the fights that defined the tavern. There was another kind of battle, more subtle but no less important: the battle of status. The tavern, despite its rough exterior, was a place where social order was played out in small ways. A well-dressed merchant might sit at the same table as a poor craftsman, but there would always be a certain distance between them. The merchant would sip his wine more carefully, his words more measured. He would speak with a tone that suggested he was above the brawling that came so easily to the commoners. And yet, he too was drawn to the tavern, the only place where he could escape the constraints of his status for a few hours and live like the people he considered below him. But even in these moments of seeming equality, there was still the unspoken knowledge that the tavern was not truly a neutral ground. It was simply a place where the roles of society were put on pause for a brief respite. Of course, the women who entered the tavern were not often seen as participants in these rituals of drinking and fighting. They sat at the edges of the room, serving ale or standing watch over the men they were related to. Their voices were rarely heard in the raucous debates or the shouting matches that took place around the tables. They were a background presence in the chaos of the tavern, moving in and out of the scene, their roles subservient to the needs of the men. Yet, even within this structure, there were moments when a woman's voice could break through the noise. Perhaps it was a wife calling out for her drunken husband to stop. Perhaps it was the laughter of a barmaid teasing the men who couldn't quite hold their drink. But for the most part, the tavern was a place for men, a place where their actions could be both celebrated and condemned in equal measure. As the night wore on, the mood would inevitably shift. What had begun as a carefree evening would often devolve into something far darker. By the time the moon had risen high in the sky, the noise in the tavern would have become more subdued, the rowdiness of earlier hours replaced with the dull hum of drunken murmurs. But even in this lull, the potential for chaos was never far off. A man who had drunk too much might stumble out into the street, foolishly challenging the first passerby to a fight. A group of men might find themselves arguing over an old grievance, their tempers flaring once more, despite the late hour. The tavern, in all its chaotic glory, was never truly done with its patrons until the very last drop of ale had been drunk, the last word spoken. Yet the tavern's significance was more than just its role as a breeding ground for brawls and drunken revelry. It was also a social center, a place where gossip and news flowed as freely as the ale. Taverns were the unofficial hubs of communication in the medieval world. If you wanted to know the latest news about a neighboring town or the gossip surrounding the latest royal decree, the tavern was where you would go to hear it. News spread like wildfire within those walls. carried on the breath of those who had too much to drink and not enough to lose. Whether it was a new law passed by the king or rumors about a neighboring village being struck by disease, the tavern was the place where the world outside seemed to condense into a single, chaotic moment. For many, the tavern was a necessary escape. It was the only place where they could forget their troubles, where the weight of the day's work could be shed with a few hearty swigs of ale. It was a chance to let go of the strictures of their roles in society, to become, if only for a short time, someone else. The peasant, the merchant, the noble, they all found themselves in the same smoky room, united in their shared need for release. And yet, for all its promise of freedom, the tavern was also a place where the chains of society were most evident, where the divisions between the classes could be felt most keenly. In the end, the medieval tavern was both a refuge and a battlefield. It was where laughter and violence collided, where the mundane and the extraordinary met in a dance of survival and camaraderie. And though it was never a place of comfort or peace, it was the beating heart of a world that had little room for either. The tavern was a reflection of medieval life itself, rough, unyielding, and unpredictable, but also essential to the rhythm of the people who lived it. A place where chaos reigned. And yet, in that chaos, something resembling order could be found. The tavern was, in many ways, the heart of medieval society, but it was also a breeding ground for disease, a dangerous place where the unsanitary conditions posed a constant threat to anyone who stepped through its weathered doors. Cleanliness, you see, was not something anyone could afford. There were no such luxuries as running water, no convenient ways to wash one's hands before a meal, or even a proper place to relieve oneself. The tavern, by design, was a place where hygiene had little place, and where every inch of its grimy floors and poorly ventilated rooms told a story of squalor and neglect. Picture yourself stepping inside this dim, crowded space. The thick smell of ale and unwashed bodies hangs in the air like an oppressive fog. The floor beneath your feet is not solid wood or stone, but a sticky mash of mud, spilled drinks, food scraps, and, worse, human waste. Without modern plumbing or sanitation, the tavern floor became a dumping ground for whatever couldn't be thrown out the window, and with so many people crammed into one small area, the waste and filth would pile up quickly. The stench of urine and excrement permeated every corner of the tavern, mixed with the sickly sweet smell of fermenting food and stale beer. The lack of proper sanitation was not a minor inconvenience. It was a constant, dangerous threat. Chamber pots, filled to the brim with human waste, were used for relief inside the tavern, with the contents often spilled or forgotten, creating pools of filth on the floor. Patrons, too drunk to notice or too accustomed to the conditions, would stumble over these puddles of waste, leaving behind a trail of contamination. In a world with no understanding of germs or bacteria, the consequences of such neglect were not fully realized, but the results were no less devastating. Disease was a constant companion in the medieval tavern, lurking just beneath the surface of every ale-soaked conversation, every laugh shared between patrons. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever spread easily in the crowded, unsanitary conditions. It wasn't just the visible filth, but the invisible pathogens that traveled from one person to another. A cough in the corner, a careless touch on a shared mug, a drunken stumble into a puddle of waste, all of it worked together to create a perfect storm of illness. The tavern was a place where your chances of walking out healthy were far slimmer than simply surviving the night without some form of infection. The primitive hygiene of the medieval tavern was a reflection of the world outside its walls. Life in medieval times was harsh, and people were accustomed to living with the grime and grit that came with survival. The rich and the poor alike were equally exposed to the filth of everyday life. The lords in their castles, though they might have cleaner floors, still used chamber pots and had little more in the way of sanitation than the tavern patrons they looked down upon. The poor, meanwhile, had no choice but to endure the dirt and disease that surrounded them, whether in the streets or inside the tavern. Tavern keepers, perhaps aware of the conditions but unable to do much about them, often made the best of the situation. They would sweep the floors with the same frequency, that one might sweep away the last remnants of the evening's revelry rarely. Instead, their focus was on keeping the ale flowing and the brawls contained, not on sanitizing the space that had become so central to the daily life of the villagers. Even if they had wanted to clean, they had few options. Water was a luxury, and the tavern's limited resources were spent on the more immediate needs of keeping the business running. The most shocking part of all, though, was how the patrons, despite their own suffering from these conditions, seemed to accept the environment as a part of life. After all, if you lived in a world where personal hygiene was not a concern, and health was often seen as something governed by fate rather than cleanliness, what else could you do? A man might spend hours, if not days, on the road, covered in dirt, sweat, and grime. Arriving at the tavern, he would not bother with cleaning himself before drinking, and neither would anyone else. The dirt that clung to his clothes was as familiar as his own skin. The stink of sweat and beer was so commonplace that it was hardly remarked upon. And so, the cycle continued. Patrons would stagger in, desperate for a drink and a moment of forgetfulness, and they would drink and gamble and fight, all the while breathing in the fetid air, inhaling the stench of bodily fluids and waste. Yet, in some ways, the tavern's rawness became a kind of comfort. In a world so defined by hardship, where survival itself was a constant struggle, the tavern was simply another place of imperfection. It wasn't so much that people enjoyed the filth. It was more that they simply couldn't escape it. It was part of life, part of living, and so they endured. It wasn't only the floors that caused problems. The very air you breathed in the tavern was a hazard. The dense smoke of cheap tobacco, the lingering stench of food scraps, and the wet, damp air of a poorly ventilated room combined to create an environment that was nearly as harmful as the diseases on the floor. Poor ventilation meant that the thick, stagnant air could not escape, trapping the fumes inside. As people gathered closer to the fire or the low-burning candles, they inhaled more than just the warmth. They inhaled the life of the tavern itself, every breath a reminder of the darkness and decay that surrounded them. But even as the patrons accepted these conditions, they would have been painfully aware of their dangers. Many of the illnesses that spread through the tavern were not immediately fatal, but the risk of dying from something as simple as a cough or a stomach ache was high. If you were unlucky enough to catch dysentery after drinking from a shared mug or eating a poorly prepared meal, you would not be given much time to recover. The tavern's lack of cleanliness made every small injury or illness a potential death sentence. And so, in a strange way, the tavern's very existence was a reminder of the fragility of life. The patrons came for the warmth, for the ale, and for the camaraderie, but they also came knowing that the risks they faced were a part of the package. The tavern, like the world outside, was not a place for comfort or safety. It was a place where survival was an act of sheer will. As the night grew late and the candles burned lower, the same patrons who had spent hours drinking and laughing began to feel the weight of the air, the dust, and the grime that surrounded them. They had spent their time in the tavern to forget, but the reality of its conditions was something they could not escape, and so they would stumble out into the cold night, leaving behind the smoke, the filth, and the germs that filled the air. But even then, as they stepped back into the darkness of the medieval world, they were still no safer. Disease, after all, didn't wait for the tavern doors to close. It waited for the careless touch, the unwashed hand, and the fragile health of those who lived in the chaos. In the end, the tavern was a place of contradictions. It was both a refuge and a danger. It was where the community came together, but it was also a place where disease and filth lurked at every turn. It was a necessary part of life in the medieval world, and yet it was a reminder of just how harsh and unforgiving that world could be. The primitive hygiene of the tavern, with its layers of muck and disease, painted a grim picture of life in those times. Survival was not just about strength or wit, but also about how well you could endure the dirt, the disease, and the discomforts that came with every day. The medieval tavern, despite its reputation for revelry and chaos, was first and foremost a place to eat. It was a place to stave off hunger after a long day of labor in the fields, or a difficult journey through the harsh landscape. But don't imagine a comforting meal of hearty stew or freshly baked bread, the kind of meal one might dream of in a warm, welcoming inn. No, the food served in these rough establishments was often nothing more than a haphazard collection of leftovers, poorly prepared scraps, and dubious offerings. It was fit only for those who had little choice but to make do with what was on hand. Picture the scene. You enter the tavern, the warmth of the fire beckoning you, and your stomach growling with the hunger of a long day. The air smells of roasting meat, but as you approach the counter, you quickly realize that the smell is more of a disguise than a promise. The bread, crusty and thick, has seen better days. Hard and dry, it crumbles in your mouth, almost like chewing through an old piece of leather. You glance around, hoping for something more substantial, but the dishes laid before you are uninviting pottage and soup that have been simmering for hours, if not days. These meals, known for their longevity and ease of preparation, are the staple of the medieval tavern. They are not gourmet creations meant to satisfy the senses, but rather survival food, designed to fill the stomach without much thought for quality or taste. Pottage, the cornerstone of medieval tavern food, was a thick, gruel-like concoction made from whatever ingredients were at hand: vegetables, grains, sometimes meat, if the tavern keeper had managed to procure it. But you would be lucky to get anything more than a few meager chunks of salted meat floating in the pot. More often than not, the pottage was simply a watery stew of oats, beans, or turnips, simmered until they formed a mush that could barely be distinguished from the pot itself. But the real danger lay not in the blandness of the food, but in its unpredictability. The tavern keeper might have cooked up a fresh batch of pottage that day, but there was also the chance that what was served to you had been sitting on the stove for days, or even weeks. The concept of a perpetual stew was common in medieval times, where leftover food from previous days or even weeks was simply replenished with whatever was available, constantly building on itself like an unbroken cycle. You might be getting stew made with vegetables that had already started to rot, or worse, meat that had gone bad. The tavern keeper didn't worry too much about throwing away food. Waste was something that was actively avoided in the medieval world, and so the food was kept, reheated, and reserved until it could no longer be recognized as anything other than a sickly gray mush. But it wasn't just the pottage that was unpredictable. The bread, too, was a gamble. Bakers often reused dough that had been left overnight, mixing it with fresh flour and water to create a loaf that might be as hard as a stone by the time it reached your plate. Some taverns might have served their bread fresh, but most did not have the resources to bake daily, and so the bread was often stale, dry, and unappetizing. The bread's sole purpose, it seemed, was to act as a vehicle to mop up the pottage or stew, not to be enjoyed in its own right. Salted fish, which was common on the menu, was another danger. The preservation of fish through salting was an ancient practice meant to make it last longer without refrigeration. But over time, the salt would dry out the flesh, making it tough and unpalatable. Even worse, if the fish was stored improperly or left too long, it could become tainted with bacteria, leading to food poisoning. Many tavern-goers, too drunk to care or too desperate to turn down a meal, ate it without hesitation, unaware of the dangers lurking in each bite. Salted fish, often accompanied by sour cabbage or another bitter vegetable, was not the nourishing meal a man might dream of after a long day. It was a meal of survival, a meal that left the eater yearning for something, anything better. Perhaps the most unpredictable food of all, however, was the hunter's pot, a stew made from whatever meat the tavern keeper had managed to procure that day. This dish could be a rare treat, containing tender cuts of beef or venison, but more often than not, it was a blend of whatever scraps were available, be it rabbit, pig, or even a dubious mixture of offal. The meat, if it could be called that, might have been tough, old, and stringy, or it could have been slightly rancid, seasoned with herbs to mask the smell. The hunter's pot was meant to give the illusion of a hearty meal, but in reality, it was just another way to use up whatever was left in the larder. And there was always the chance that something truly horrifying would make its way onto the menu. Some taverns, desperate to avoid throwing away anything that could be eaten, would serve up questionable meats, such as tripe or entrails. The less appetizing cuts of meat were often slow-cooked for hours in a broth, but even the best seasoning couldn't hide the fact that you were eating something that most people wouldn't have touched with a 10-foot pole. It wasn't unusual for patrons to encounter something in their stew that resembled more closely a part of an animal they had no desire to identify: glands, hooves, even eyes, all tossed into the pot and boiled down into an unrecognizable mush. For many, eating in the tavern was a matter of necessity, not choice. The tavern provided the only available meal, and the patrons, who were often poor and far from home, had little other option than to accept what was served. The food didn't have to be good, it had to be enough to stave off hunger and keep the body functioning long enough to face another day's work. In a world without refrigeration, without modern preservatives or knowledge of food safety, there was little room for complaints. If you ate what was available, and if you didn't, you risked going hungry. The chance of getting sick from food poisoning or disease was high, but it was a risk that many had no choice but to take. Yet, in the harshness of this life, there was a kind of dark humor to it all. The food in the tavern wasn't meant to be enjoyable. It was meant to be sustenance. You weren't there to feast. You were there to survive. Strangely, the grim, unpredictable nature of the food in the tavern mirrored the very nature of medieval life itself. Unpredictable, hard, and often cruel. There was no room for luxury, no space for indulgence. The tavern food was the perfect reflection of a world where even the most basic needs were not guaranteed, where survival often depended on nothing more than grit and determination. In a sense, the food in the tavern became a symbol of everything that the medieval world represented. It was crude, it was sometimes disgusting, but it was necessary. You ate to live, not to enjoy, and you learned to make do with whatever scraps you could get. For many, the tavern provided the only warmth, the only company, and the only meal that could sustain them. The food, though far from perfect, was as much a part of the experience as the brawls, the laughter, and the stale air. It was a reminder that in the medieval world, even the most basic comforts were often fleeting, and survival was the greatest luxury of all. If the tavern was a breeding ground for disease, a chaotic meeting point for all walks of life, then poor lighting was its ever-present shadow, a lurking threat, not only to one's safety but to one's very sense of security. The tavern was not a place bathed in the soft glow of candlelight or warm hearth fires, where you could sit and converse comfortably with friends. No, the flickering light was more like a fragile thread keeping the darkness at bay, a dark thread that could snap at any moment. Shadows clung to the walls, whispering with the secrets of those who dared enter and reminding you that this place was not built for safety or comfort. As you made your way deeper into the tavern, you noticed how the light seemed to retreat, as if trying to escape the bustling chaos within. The candles on the tables, few and far between, did little to illuminate the vast, cluttered space. They were nothing more than tiny flames flickering weakly in the thick air, trying to hold their ground against the encroaching shadows. The only source of real light came from the fire in the hearth, but even that was weak, casting, dancing, twisted shadows on the walls. The tavern was a place of muted tones, dark wood, and deep corners, where every movement seemed to create a new shadow. You could never quite shake the feeling that something or someone was lurking just beyond the edge of your vision. This poor lighting, so commonplace in these establishments, was more than a mere inconvenience. It was a silent accomplice to the tavern's inherent dangers. The darkness made it easy for theft to flourish. A man could approach the bar with his mug in hand, eyes fixed on the frothy ale before him, only to have his coin purse disappear in the blink of an eye. The darkness shielded the thief, and the meager flicker of the candlelight did little to reveal the culprit. With the tavern crowded, with people jostling one another for space at the bar, or huddling in tight corners, it was not hard for someone to make off with your possessions while you were distracted by the noise and bustle of the place. The risk wasn't just from pickpockets. In the dim light, it was hard to discern a friend from a foe. The tavern, by its very nature, was a place of conflict. Brawls, disputes, and confrontations simmered beneath the surface. But it was the darkness that allowed them to explode into violence. A friendly jest or a drunken joke could be misinterpreted in the murky shadows, and before you knew it, a quarrel had erupted into a fight. Fists flew in every direction, the crash of wood against flesh mixing with the shouts and curses that filled the room. In the dark, there was little to stop the escalation of violence, no light to bring clarity, no calm to rein in the primal instincts of men. Even when the fighting subsided, the dark corners of the tavern still felt heavy, like the very air was holding its breath. With the flickering light and the shadows surrounding you, every creak of the floorboards, every whisper, every low murmur in the far corners could seem like a threat. The tavern, always teetering on the edge of chaos, felt even more dangerous in the poorly lit spaces, where the sense of foreboding was palpable. You never truly knew who was watching, who was lurking in the shadows, or who might strike next. The lack of light was also a constant danger when it came to moving around the tavern. The floor, a patchwork of uneven wooden planks, loose nails, and remnants of spilled ale, was treacherous even in the best of times. But in the dark, the risks were even greater. Drunken patrons stumbled around, their eyes half closed from the weight of the alcohol, trying to find their way through the cramped space, only to trip over a stray stool or crash into a table. The dimness made every step feel uncertain. One wrong move, and you might end up on the floor, bruised and battered, with no one to help you. It was a dangerous world in those shadows, and the weak light from the flickering candles did little to guide you. And then there were the fires. In a tavern so poorly lit, where the glow from the hearth was the only real source of illumination, fire was an ever-present danger. Many taverns used open flames not just for the hearth, but also for candles on the tables and torches in the walls. With so many patrons crammed into a single, tight space, it didn't take much for the smallest of accidents to turn into a catastrophe. A careless stumble, a spilled mug of ale, a too close encounter with a flickering candle, and suddenly a fire could break out. The dry wood of the walls, the rush of air from the open windows, and the clutter of patrons could turn the tavern into an inferno in minutes. It wasn't uncommon for a tavern to burn to the ground, leaving nothing behind but smoldering ruins and the ashes of those caught in the flames. And even when the fire didn't rage out of control, there was always the threat of smoke, thick and choking, filling the tavern and making it hard to breathe. The dim lighting combined with the smoke created an atmosphere where clarity was impossible and safety was a mere illusion. The danger wasn't just physical, it was psychological too. The poorly lit tavern contributed to the feeling of isolation and paranoia that often plagued those who found themselves within its walls. In a place so dark, so claustrophobic, the simple act of drinking or talking with friends felt like an act of rebellion against the oppressive darkness. There was no escape from the dimness. The longer you stayed, the more you felt like the shadows were closing in on you, the walls pressing in from every side. The tavern was a microcosm of medieval life itself, claustrophobic, unpredictable, and filled with hidden dangers, some visible, others lurking just beyond the edge of the candlelight. But perhaps the most subtle danger of poor lighting was the way it distorted perceptions. In the shadows, a man could appear larger than life, his movements exaggerated in the flickering light. Faces, once friendly, could twist into something more menacing in the dark. When you couldn't see clearly, the lines between ally and adversary became blurred. A tavern-goer might think they saw a friendly face across the room, only to realize too late that it was someone with a grudge, someone who had been watching them for far too long. In the dim light, everything seemed more uncertain, more dangerous. Nothing could be trusted, and everyone seemed a potential threat. The poor lighting of the tavern, in the end, was more than just an inconvenience. It was a constant threat, one that shaped the entire experience of the place. In a world without the modern comforts of electricity or reliable street lighting, the tavern was a place where danger and darkness went hand in hand. It wasn't just the shadows on the walls that made the tavern unsafe, it was the way those shadows brought out the darker impulses in the people who filled the space. In the tavern, where the light was weak and the risks were great, you learned quickly that survival meant not just staying out of the way of the brawls and the dangers, but also knowing how to navigate the unseen threats that lurked just beyond your line of sight. The tavern, much like medieval life itself, was a place where clarity was scarce and safety was never guaranteed. In the end, the poor lighting of the medieval tavern was both a literal and metaphorical reflection of the life outside. It was a world of uncertainty, a world where the shadows could hide anything from a thief's hands to a deadly weapon. And it was a world where you had to learn to adapt, to accept the darkness, and to survive the perils it brought with it. If the tavern was a breeding ground for disease, a chaotic meeting point for all walks of life, then poor lighting was its ever-present shadow, a lurking threat not only to one's safety but to one's very sense of security. The tavern was not a place bathed in the soft glow of candlelight or warm hearth fires, where you could sit and converse comfortably with friends. No, the flickering light was more like a fragile thread, keeping the darkness at bay, a dark thread that could snap at any moment. Shadows clung to the walls, whispering with the secrets of those who dared enter and reminding you that this place was not built for safety or comfort. As you made your way deeper into the tavern, you noticed how the light seemed to retreat, as if trying to escape the bustling chaos within. The candles on the tables, few and far between, did little to illuminate the vast cluttered space. They were nothing more than tiny flames flickering weakly in the thick air, trying to hold their ground against the encroaching shadows. The only source of real light came from the fire in the hearth, but even that was weak, casting dancing, twisted shadows on the walls. The tavern was a place of muted tones, dark wood, and deep corners, where every movement seemed to create a new shadow. You could never quite shake the feeling that something or someone was lurking just beyond the edge of your vision. This poor lighting, so commonplace in these establishments, was more than a mere inconvenience. It was a silent accomplice to the tavern's inherent dangers. The darkness made it easy for theft to flourish. A man could approach the bar with his mug in hand, eyes fixed on the frothy ale before him, only to have his coin purse disappear in the blink of an eye. The darkness shielded the thief, and the meager flicker of the candlelight did little to reveal the culprit. With the tavern crowded, with people jostling one another for space at the bar or huddling in tight corners, it was not hard for someone to make off with your possessions while you were distracted by the noise and bustle of the place. The risk wasn't just from pickpockets. In the dim light, it was hard to discern a friend from a foe. The tavern, by its very nature, was a place of conflict. Brawls, disputes, and confrontations simmered beneath the surface. But it was the darkness that allowed them to explode into violence. A friendly jest or a drunken joke could be misinterpreted in the murky shadows, and before you knew it, a quarrel had erupted into a fight. Fists flew in every direction, the crash of wood against flesh mixing with the shouts and curses that filled the room. In the dark, there was little to stop the escalation of violence, no light to bring clarity, no calm to rein in the primal instincts of men. Even when the fighting subsided, the dark corners of the tavern still felt heavy, like the very air was holding its breath. With the flickering light and the shadows surrounding you, every creak of the floorboards, every whisper, every low murmur in the far corners could seem like a threat. The tavern, always teetering on the edge of chaos, felt even more dangerous in the poorly lit spaces, where the sense of foreboding was palpable. You never truly knew who was watching, who was lurking in the shadows, or who might strike next. The lack of light was also a constant danger when it came to moving around the tavern. The floor, a patchwork of uneven wooden planks, loose nails, and remnants of spilled ale, was treacherous even in the best of times. But in the dark, the risks were even greater. Drunken patrons stumbled around, their eyes half closed from the weight of the alcohol, trying to find their way through the cramped space, only to trip over a stray stool or crash into a table. The dimness made every step feel uncertain. One wrong move, and you might end up on the floor, bruised and battered, with no one to help you. It was a dangerous world in those shadows, and the weak light from the flickering candles did little to guide you. And then there were the fires, in a tavern so poorly lit, where the glow from the hearth was the only real source of illumination. Fire was an ever-present danger. Many taverns used open flames not just for the hearth, but also for candles on the tables and torches in the walls. With so many patrons crammed into a single, tight space, it didn't take much for the smallest of accidents to turn into a catastrophe. A careless stumble, a spilled mug of ale, a too close encounter with a flickering candle, and suddenly, a fire could break out. The dry wood of the walls, the rush of air from the open windows, and the clutter of patrons could turn the tavern into an inferno in minutes. It wasn't uncommon for a tavern to burn to the ground, leaving nothing behind but smoldering ruins and the ashes of those caught in the flames. And even when the fire didn't rage out of control, there was always the threat of smoke, thick and choking, filling the tavern and making it hard to breathe. The dim lighting combined with the smoke created an atmosphere where clarity was impossible and safety was a mere illusion. The danger wasn't just physical, it was psychological too. The poorly lit tavern contributed to the feeling of isolation and paranoia that often plagued those who found themselves within its walls. In a place so dark, so claustrophobic, the simple act of drinking or talking with friends felt like an act of rebellion against the oppressive darkness. There was no escape from the dimness. The longer you stayed, the more you felt like the shadows were closing in on you, the walls pressing in from every side. The tavern was a microcosm of medieval life itself, claustrophobic, unpredictable, and filled with hidden dangers, some visible, others lurking just beyond the edge of the candlelight. But perhaps the most subtle danger of poor lighting was the way it distorted perceptions. In the shadows, a man could appear larger than life, his movements exaggerated in the flickering light. Faces, once friendly, could twist into something more menacing in the dark. When you couldn't see clearly, the lines between ally and adversary became blurred. A tavern-goer might think they saw a friendly face across the room, only to realize too late that it was someone with a grudge, someone who had been watching them for far too long. In the dim light, everything seemed more uncertain, more dangerous. Nothing could be trusted, and everyone seemed a potential threat. The poor lighting of the tavern, in the end, was more than just an inconvenience. It was a constant threat, one that shaped the entire experience of the place. In a world without the modern comforts of electricity or reliable street lighting, the tavern was a place where danger and darkness went hand in hand. It wasn't just the shadows on the walls that made the tavern unsafe. It was the way those shadows brought out the darker impulses in the people who filled the space. In the tavern, where the light was weak and the risks were great, you learned quickly that survival meant not just staying out of the way of the brawls and the dangers, but also knowing how to navigate the unseen threats that lurked just beyond your line of sight. The tavern, much like medieval life itself, was a place where clarity was scarce, and safety was never guaranteed. In the end, the poor lighting of the medieval tavern was both a literal and metaphorical reflection of the life outside. It was a world of uncertainty, a world where the shadows could hide anything from a thief's hands to a deadly weapon. And it was a world where you had to learn to adapt, to accept the darkness, and to survive the perils it brought with it. As if the foul smells and chaotic atmosphere weren't enough to dampen the spirits of any would-be tavern-goer, there was another, far more unsettling presence. This made the medieval tavern a truly undesirable place to spend any length of time. The rats. These unwelcome creatures, ever present and impossible to avoid, scurried about with the same familiarity as the drunken brawlers and weary travelers. In fact, they were as much a part of the tavern experience as the ale-soaked laughter, the stale bread, and the brawls that erupted over nothing. It was impossible to escape them, and once you stepped inside, The rats seemed to be an inescapable part of the tavern's grim rhythm. Picture it now. You're sitting at a wobbly table in the corner of the tavern, the flickering candlelight casting shadows that stretch long across the floor. The air is thick with the acrid scent of sweat, stale beer, and unwashed bodies. But there's another smell mixed in, something more insidious. A faint odor of decay, of something left too long to rot, hangs in the air. You try to ignore it, focusing on the mug of ale before you, but your eyes catch movement at the edge of the floor. There, near the crumbling wooden wall, a rat emerges, its beady eyes glinting in the dim light as it scurries over the floor, looking for scraps to nibble on. It's not alone, there are others, darting in and out of the shadows, their tiny claws scraping against the rough floorboards. The rats weren't just a nuisance in the tavern. They were a real and present danger. Their numbers were legion, thriving in the same filth that the tavern patrons had learned to live with. The floor, sticky with spilled ale, food scraps, and the remnants of whatever had been served earlier, became a haven for these rodents. Their presence was not only a sign of poor hygiene, it was a reflection of the unsanitary conditions that prevailed in every corner of the tavern. The rats fed on the scraps that fell from the tables, the remains of half-eaten meals, and the food that had long since gone bad, adding to the ever-growing pile of refuse that lined the tavern's floors. These rats weren't just looking for food. They were also after something far more insidious: disease. The medieval world, with its lack of modern sanitation and medical knowledge, was a breeding ground for illnesses, and rats played a key role in the spread of many of them. Their presence in the tavern was more than a simple annoyance. It was a ticking time bomb of contamination. Rats carried with them parasites, including fleas and lice, which were known to transmit diseases like the plague and other deadly infections. The very presence of these creatures inside the tavern was a threat to anyone who came into contact with them, whether directly or indirectly. Fleas, once aboard a rat, would often jump from one unfortunate victim to another, hopping onto the clothing of tavern-goers, or even the food that was being served. The fleas carried with them the bacteria that caused the plague, a disease that would sweep through medieval populations with terrifying speed. But even beyond the infamous plague, rats were known to spread other diseases, such as typhus and salmonella, through their waste, their fur, and the very air they helped contaminate. For those unlucky enough to have a rat scurry across their legs or crawl near their food, the experience was more than just an unpleasant one. It was a reminder of the ever-present danger lurking in the shadows. It wasn't unusual to see patrons swatting at the floor in a futile attempt to chase away the rodents, but most of the time, the rats simply kept to the darker corners of the tavern. They thrived in the piles of refuse and waste that were never properly cleaned. And while the tavern keeper may have noticed their presence, there was little they could do. The rats were a fact of life, a consequence of the filth that surrounded the tavern, and nothing short of a complete overhaul of the tavern's environment could have driven them out. But the vermin didn't just stop with rats. Mice, too, were a constant problem, darting between cracks in the walls or under the tables, seeking the same food sources. They weren't quite as large as the rats, but they carried with them the same risks. Mice, too, could infest the food supply, nibbling at anything left unattended and carrying disease with every scurry. The mice often shared the same burrows as their rat counterparts, and when they weren't feeding on scraps, they were burrowing into the dark corners of the tavern, leaving their mark on the environment. But the problem didn't end with the rodents. Fleas, lice, and other insects thrived in the unsanitary conditions too. In an age where hygiene was barely understood and personal cleanliness was often neglected, fleas and lice were common afflictions among the tavern's patrons and staff alike. The insects would feast on the blood of the living, moving from person to person, creating yet another layer of discomfort in an already difficult environment. For many, dealing with lice or the occasional flea bite was just another part of life in the tavern, a constant irritation that they learned to live with. Yet it was also a dangerous one, as these pests, like the rats, carried diseases that could spread with alarming speed. The presence of so many rats and vermin not only created an unhealthy atmosphere, but also a sense of helplessness among the tavern-goers. What could they do? The world outside the tavern was no better, and in many ways, it was worse. The same pests that plagued the tavern also infested the homes of the poor, the fields where food was grown, and the streets where people walked. In a world where cleanliness was a luxury that few could afford, the vermin became just another fact of life, a constant reminder of the harsh realities of medieval existence. Yet, despite the clear dangers posed by the rats and other vermin, there was little to be done. The tavern keeper, burdened with the task of keeping the ale flowing and the patrons happy, had little time or resources to worry about exterminating rats. For most, it was simply a matter of enduring. They could complain about the rats, the fleas, and the filth. But it didn't change the fact that, in medieval society, survival was about accepting the discomforts and dangers that came with life. In some ways, the rats in the tavern represented the very essence of medieval life, dirty, unpredictable, and full of hidden dangers. They were a constant, insidious presence, a reminder that even in the most basic parts of life, there was no escape from the chaos and the hardships that came with living in a world without modern sanitation or medicine. The tavern, for all its warmth, camaraderie, and escape, was also a place where survival was a delicate balance, one that required both tolerance for the filth and a constant awareness of the dangers lurking in the dark corners. As the rats scurried beneath the tables, the flickering light from the candles catching their tiny, glinting eyes, the tavern-goers carried on with their drinking and laughter, unaware or too used to the rats to care. It was just another part of the tavern's strange, hazardous charm, a feature that, like everything else in that chaotic world, had to be accepted if you were to survive another night. The rats, the fleas, and the lice were not going anywhere. Neither were the people who came to the tavern, seeking warmth, companionship, and the chance to forget, if only for a moment, the grim reality of their lives outside. In the chaotic world of the medieval tavern, where drunken brawls, unsanitary conditions, and unpredictable food quality were the norm, one figure stood as the unassuming authority who held the tavern together, the tavern keeper. While the tavern itself may have been a place of disorder, where the laws of civility were often ignored and the demands of the everyday man were served with little care, it was the tavern keeper's job to ensure that the whole operation didn't descend into complete anarchy. And while it may have seemed that the tavern keeper's role was simply to serve drinks and keep the fires burning, their influence extended far beyond the clink of mugs or the stirring of the stew pot. Picture the scene as you enter the tavern once again. The air is thick with smoke, the low murmur of voices, and the clatter of mugs creating a constant hum. Amid the chaos, your eyes are drawn to the tavern keeper, standing behind the bar, overseeing the drunken revelers with an almost detached calm. The tavern keeper, often a grizzled veteran of the tavern life itself, was no stranger to the rough behavior of the patrons. They had seen it all: the fights, the drunken arguments, the patrons stumbling in, desperate for a drink to wash away the day's hardships. But in the midst of all this, the tavern keeper held the reins, however loosely. Their control was not exercised through any great formal authority, but through an unspoken understanding, an innate sense of command over the unruly space. The tavern keeper's first responsibility was to ensure that the drinks kept flowing. Ale, cider, wine, and occasionally mead, these were the lifeblood of the tavern. The tavern keeper would tend to the taps, refilling mugs with swift and practiced movements, ensuring the alcohol was always in supply, a constant companion to the patrons' endless conversations and drunken laughter. The drink was not just a commodity, it was the very thing that held the tavern together. Without it, the patrons would have little reason to remain, no need to interact, and certainly no cause to engage in the evening's unruly games. Alcohol fueled the tavern's atmosphere, and the tavern keeper was its keeper quite literally. But the tavern keeper's duties extended beyond mere service. They were the unseen force that ensured order, if only for a few hours, in a place that seemed to thrive on disorder, in a tavern where the patrons were often in varying states of intoxication, where tempers could flare as quickly as a fight broke out. The tavern keeper's role was to maintain some semblance of decorum. They had to intervene in the countless arguments that would erupt over everything from a poorly played game of dice to an insult that was taken too far. Their presence was often the only thing standing between a pleasant evening and a bloody brawl. A stern word, a raised hand, a firm voice. These were the tools the tavern keeper used to restore a sense of order, even if it was temporary. But even as the tavern keeper managed the space with an almost paternalistic air, they also embodied a deeper sense of control. They weren't just there to ensure a good time was had. They were also there to keep the law of the tavern in check. Every tavern had its rules, some spoken, some unspoken, and it was the tavern keeper's responsibility to enforce them. In a world with few formal laws in place for the everyday person, the tavern keeper was the final arbiter, the one who decided whether a patron's behavior was acceptable or whether it warranted expulsion. If a fight broke out, the tavern keeper would often be the one to break it up, commanding both the combatants and the surrounding patrons to step back. If someone was too drunk and rowdy, they could be shown the door, though. In the medieval world, this was often an easier threat than reality. But the tavern keeper's authority wasn't just about quelling the violence that was so often the result of too much drink. They were also the unofficial mediator of the tavern's smaller dramas. Debts were a common issue in medieval taverns, and it was the tavern keeper who managed them with an iron hand. The patrons, frequently short on coin but always eager to drink, would often run tabs, borrowing money or drinks on credit until the end of the week or the next payment cycle. This could lead to disputes over payments, and the tavern keeper had to balance the delicate art of keeping the customer happy while ensuring they didn't end up in the red. If a debt wasn't paid, it could result in the debtor being thrown out, or worse, forced to work off their debt in exchange for room and board. This kind of management wasn't without its own challenges. Many tavern keepers had to navigate the fine line between enforcing order and maintaining enough leniency to keep the business flowing. The tavern was a social space, after all, and its patrons expected to be treated with a certain amount of respect, even in the most chaotic of circumstances. The tavern keeper, however, was also in a precarious position. They were the ones who had to maintain relationships with both their patrons and the local authorities. Too many fights or too much unruliness could draw the attention of the town's bailiffs or even the church, which had a keen interest in keeping taverns from spiraling into total disorder. In a time when the local government had more influence over everyday life, the tavern keeper's role was often more political than one might imagine. While the tavern keeper was the enforcer of rules, they were also the keeper of the tavern's soul. The tavern was not just a business, it was a reflection of the tavern keeper's character and values. In many ways, the tavern keeper shaped the culture of the tavern itself. If they were a hard-nosed, no-nonsense type, the tavern reflected that, and patrons knew to toe the line. If they were more easygoing and indulgent, the tavern became a more relaxed space, one where patrons could come and go as they pleased, without much interference. The tavern keeper's style set the tone for everything that happened within the tavern walls. But the tavern keeper's influence didn't end at the bar. They were also the ones who maintained the overall atmosphere of the tavern, from the way the ale was served to the cleanliness of the tables and floors. A well-maintained tavern, even in its grimy, unkempt state, was still a place where patrons felt comfortable enough to return. The tavern keeper knew that reputation was everything. Word of mouth, especially in a small community, could either make or break a tavern. A tavern that was known for its cleanliness, its good service, and its fair prices would see a steady stream of customers, while one that was poorly managed would be shunned, its doors locked tight. And perhaps the most important and most dangerous part of the tavern keeper's job was navigating the fine balance between the tavern's business needs and the law. In a time when alcohol was one of the few consistent pleasures available to the masses, The tavern keeper's role often had them caught between the desires of the patrons and the pressure of maintaining order. There were always those who would push the limits, ordering more drinks than they could afford, or getting involved in activities that, though accepted in the tavern's chaotic environment, could be considered criminal if taken outside its walls. The tavern keeper had to keep the peace, protect their business, and, in some cases, keep the local authorities off their backs. It wasn't just about keeping the patrons happy. It was about keeping them alive, keeping their business running, and keeping the tavern from falling into complete disarray. In the end, the tavern keeper's role was one of constant vigilance, constant management. They were the quiet force behind the chaos, ensuring that the tavern ran smoothly even as it teetered on the edge of disorder. The tavern keeper was both the law and the caretaker, the protector and the enforcer. Without their steady hand guiding the way, the tavern would be little more than a den of depravity and lawlessness, a place where the rawness of life could be tasted, but not endured. In the chaotic world of the medieval tavern, where the air was thick with the scent of sweat and spilt ale, where brawls could erupt at any moment, and the very floor seemed to shift beneath your feet, there was one thing that remained undeniably constant: the social hierarchy. Though the tavern itself was a place where commoners, travelers, and even the occasional noble mingled, the interactions that took place within its walls were governed by strict and often unspoken rules of class and status. As you entered the tavern, the first thing that struck you was the noise. The clatter of mugs, the chatter of voices, the occasional burst of laughter. It was an overwhelming soundscape. But as your eyes adjusted to the dim light, you began to notice the subtle divisions that existed within the tavern. Divisions that were not based on the size of one's wallet, but on the social role one played in the broader world outside. The tavern, in its way, was a microcosm of the medieval society at large, and just as society outside had rigid divisions between the nobility, the clergy, and the common folk, so too did the tavern. The first division you would notice was the physical one. The layout of the tavern itself reflected the social distinctions that ruled the day. The wealthier patrons, those who could afford to drink the finer wines and meads, were given the best seats near the fire, where the warmth of the hearth could provide comfort against the chill of the outside world. These seats were also the most visible, placed where the nobility could be seen by all, in positions of prominence within the tavern. The wood of the tables they sat at was newer, smoother, and more carefully maintained. These seats were not just for comfort. They were a way to broadcast their wealth and status. Meanwhile, those who were less fortunate were relegated to the darker corners of the tavern, the farthest reaches of the room where the fire's warmth barely reached. These were the common folk farmers, laborers, and tradesmen who scraped by day to day and came to the tavern for a drink, for a break from their hard lives. The tables in these corners were often rough-hewn, chipped, and covered in stains and spilled drinks. They were a far cry from the polished surfaces where the noble patrons Saturday, yet despite this, there was a strange sense of equality in these back corners. It was here that the true character of the tavern revealed itself, in the shared warmth of the fire's fading glow and the camaraderie that could be found in the mutual hardship of everyday life. But even here, in the shadows of the tavern's heart, the social hierarchy remained. While the peasants and laborers might have been afforded the same basic privileges, the ale, the food, they were never given the respect that was automatically extended to those of higher rank. The tavern keeper, who played a role both as the ruler and the servant of the space, would have known exactly where each patron stood in the great hierarchy of medieval life. This knowledge was instinctual, passed down through years of experience, learned through subtle cues of clothing, speech, and behavior. It was the tavern keeper who decided whether someone was worthy of the nobler seats near the fire, and even if a common man somehow made his way to one of these spots, he would feel the eyes of the other patrons upon him, judging him for his impudence. The divide between the nobles and the common folk was not just a matter of physical seating arrangements. It extended to the way people were treated. The noble patrons, who could afford the finer wines and stronger ales, were given the best of what the tavern had to offer. Their mugs were filled first, their requests were heard most urgently, and they were rarely subjected to the harsh criticisms or disapproving glares of the other patrons. For the tavern keeper, these were the customers that mattered most. Their gold was what kept the tavern's doors open, and their comfort was what ensured the tavern's continued success. The peasants, on the other hand, were given the scraps, the leftovers, the lower quality ale. Their mugs, if they were filled at all, were filled last, and their food was often the remnants of what had been prepared earlier in the day. They might be forced to sit at tables where the benches were broken, where the firelight didn't reach, and where the cold draft from the door was felt more keenly. But they had no choice. They were the working class, the backbone of society, and their place in the tavern was simply a reflection of their place in the world outside. What's more, these distinctions in treatment weren't just based on wealth, but also on the unspoken rules of respect and honor that governed everyday life. The way someone spoke, the way they dressed, even the way they carried themselves, these were all factors that determined one's worth in the eyes of the tavern-goers. A nobleman, with his fine clothes and easy manner, would be treated with deference by the tavern keeper and the other patrons. But a peasant, no matter how hard he worked or how much he contributed to society, would always be seen as inferior. It wasn't enough that the common folk worked themselves to the bone, often for long hours. In harsh conditions they were still treated with disdain, still relegated to the margins of the social hierarchy. The tavern's role in reinforcing these social divisions extended to its activities as well. The games played in the tavern, whether it was dice or cards or even a simple game of chance, were a reflection of these hierarchies. The wealthy nobles could afford to gamble without consequence. A lost wager was a mere trifle for them, a light-hearted distraction. But for the common man, gambling was often a matter of life and death. A lost bet could mean the loss of his hard-earned wages, the few coins he had saved to feed his family, or buy necessities. For the peasants, these games were not a form of recreation. They were a reflection of their desperation. The tavern was also a place where the rules of courtly behavior and honor were, in theory, upheld. It was here that the nobles would converse in hushed tones about matters of politics, matters of land and power, while the common folk sat in silence, waiting for their chance to speak. There were few chances for a commoner to join in on the discussions of nobility, except when their opinions were sought to serve the needs of the higher class. It was a system built on obedience, on knowing one's place, and it was a system that the tavern enforced with every drink served, with every seat taken, with every word exchanged. Yet, there were moments fleeting, rare moments when the rigid structure of the tavern's hierarchy would be challenged. In times of great hardship or political unrest, when tensions ran high, the social divisions could be blurred. In those rare moments, a peasant might sit beside a nobleman, both drinking from the same mug, both sharing in the same grief. But even in those moments, the differences were always there, just beneath the surface. The reality was that these brief flashes of equality were fleeting. In the end, the social divide remained as real as ever, as entrenched as the walls of the tavern itself. As the evening wore on and the noise in the tavern grew louder, the distinctions between the classes became even clearer. The peasants, with their rough clothes and weathered faces, would continue to drink their watered-down ale in the back, while the nobles would sit at the front, enjoying their better food and wine, their voices rising in laughter. The tavern was a place where the cracks of society were laid bare, where the distinctions between the classes were made visible in the simplest of ways. It was a place where people from all walks of life came together, but only to reinforce the boundaries that separated them. And though the tavern might offer the illusion of equality, it was only ever temporary. For all its roughness, its dirt and grime, the medieval tavern was a space where the harsh realities of the world outside were reflected and, in some ways, magnified. The social hierarchies that existed in the wider world were brought inside, played out in the clink of mugs and the shuffle of feet. And as much as the tavern might have served as a refuge from the struggles of the outside world, it also served as a reminder of those same struggles, of the divisions that defined every aspect of life, In the end, the tavern, like the world outside, was a place where survival was dictated by one's position within the hierarchy. Whether noble or commoner, each person knew their place, and each person was reminded of it the moment they crossed the threshold. And though the tavern may have provided a temporary escape, it was never an escape from the fundamental realities of medieval society. In the medieval tavern, where the clink of mugs and the laughter of inebriated patrons blended with the warmth of the fire and the hum of conversation, there was one constant that could never be avoided: the dangerous unpredictability of public drunkenness. The tavern was not merely a space for socializing and relaxation. It was a place where drink fueled not just conversation, but the very essence of human behavior, and where the line between good cheer and violent misfortune was as thin as the candlelight flickering on the table. The ale was cheap, plentiful, and, often, far stronger than what we might imagine today. It was not just the poor and the downtrodden who came to drink in the tavern, but the entire spectrum of medieval society. The worker, the soldier, the merchant, and the nobleman alike found themselves drawn to the tavern's promise of release from the harshness of daily life. But while a drink could offer solace, it could also unravel the very fabric of order, giving way to brawls, quarrels, and violence that might spill out into the streets, or worse, escalate into deadly altercations. The intoxicating power of alcohol was well known, and in a time where life was often brutal, where the demands of labor, war, and survival weighed heavily on the people, the tavern offered an escape, however fleeting, from the crushing reality of existence. The drink was a friend, a companion that helped dull the pain of a hard day, or provided a momentary shield against the worries of tomorrow. But alcohol in the medieval world didn't just bring companionship, it also brought chaos. As mugs of ale were passed around the room, the atmosphere would shift, subtly at first, until the laughter grew louder and the conversations grew more animated. A few too many drinks could turn the quietest of men into rowdy, brash individuals, and the calmest of evenings could spiral into something far darker. Picture yourself in the tavern, surrounded by the familiar heat of the fire and the laughter of the patrons. The scent of roasting meat mixes with the bitter tang of the ale in your mug. At first, it's just the usual chatter, people talking about their day, discussing business, or perhaps sharing gossip from the local village. The conversations are loose and friendly, the kind of idle talk that fills the space between sips of drink. But then, something changes. A man slams his mug down a little too forcefully on the table, his face flushed from the drink. He laughs too loudly, gestures a little too wildly, and suddenly the man sitting next to him is glaring, a frown curling the edges of his lips. The smallest spark, a careless remark, a misunderstood joke, a stumble in the wrong direction could be enough to ignite the flames of conflict in the crowded tavern. The violence that so often followed public drunkenness was not necessarily premeditated. It was often a result of the ale itself, of the false sense of courage it bestowed upon those who drank too much. Words that might have been taken lightly in sobriety became triggers for violence in the haze of intoxication. An insult, even a minor one, could spark a fight, and when the brawling began, it spread quickly, as the tavern was filled with men whose judgment had been clouded by drink. Fists flew across the tables, mugs were knocked over, and chairs were thrown aside in the chaos. The air thickened with shouts and curses, and the tavern keeper, who had worked tirelessly to maintain some semblance of order, could do little but try to contain the violence before it spilled out into the streets. The tavern itself, a place of temporary refuge from the hardships of life, would become a war zone in a matter of moments, its walls echoing with the sounds of fury and pain. The line between friends and foes became blurred as alcohol clouded the patron's judgment. The man who had been your companion just hours before now became an adversary, his face contorted with rage, his words slurred and angry. The tavern keeper, who had to navigate the volatile nature of these situations daily, understood the delicate balance that had to be maintained. Their authority was constantly tested by the drunken brawls that erupted without warning. The tavern keeper would often intervene, trying to separate the combatants, their voice rising above the din of shouts, commanding the patrons to stop. But it was not always enough. Some fights were too far gone, and once the brawl had begun, it was often the loudest, most aggressive voices that carried the day. It wasn't uncommon for those involved to be thrown out sometimes by force into the cold, unforgiving streets, where the dangers were far more real. But that was little consolation for the tavern-goers who had watched their friends become involved in violence that was as much a part of the tavern's culture as the ale itself. As the night wore on, and the tavern became more crowded with rowdy drinkers, the chances of a violent outburst increased. And it wasn't just the men who were susceptible to the effects of drunkenness. Women, too, often found themselves caught up in the tavern's tumultuous atmosphere. Some taverns were frequented by women, either as patrons or as barmaids, but the tavern's culture of public drunkenness could create dangerous situations. Drunken men, emboldened by too much ale, might become overly familiar with women they barely knew, crossing boundaries that would have otherwise been respected. Arguments between men over women, or even drunken advances, could quickly escalate into brawls that disrupted the entire tavern. But it wasn't just the fights and arguments that posed a threat. Public drunkenness also puts the safety of patrons at risk in more subtle ways. A man who had drunk too much might leave the tavern, stumbling into the streets in the middle of the night, unable to find his way home. The dangers of the medieval streets, robbers, thieves, and bandits became a very real concern for the drunk and vulnerable. The violence that could break out in the tavern didn't always stay there. It spilled out into the streets, into alleys, and sometimes even into homes, where a drunken man might return, still reeling from the evening's events, looking to continue the fight. And even if the tavern-goers made it home unscathed, they still faced the threat of illness from the unsanitary conditions and the possible spread of disease that came with public drunkenness. The culture of public drunkenness, though accepted in some ways, carried with it a heavy price. It was a way of life for many, a means of escaping the hardships of the medieval world. But that escape often came at a steep cost, both in terms of physical danger and social consequences. The violence that followed public drunkenness in the tavern wasn't just a matter of personal pride or anger, it was a reflection of the frustrations, the hopelessness, and the anger that simmered just beneath the surface of daily life. The tavern was a place where the poorest of men could feel a momentary sense of power, where they could cast aside the weight of their struggles and let loose. But in doing so, they often made the consequences far worse. The risks were never far away. In a world where disease was rampant and life was uncertain, public drunkenness was another factor that tipped the scales toward misfortune. A man who had overindulged in the tavern and made it home safely might not be so lucky the next time. The tavern, for all its promises of warmth, camaraderie, and release, was ultimately a place where the human spirit, in its rawest form, was exposed, vulnerable to the effects of the drink and vulnerable to the violence that it so often unleashed. In the end, public drunkenness in the medieval tavern was as much a part of its fabric as the ale itself. It was the force that gave the tavern its edge, its chaotic energy, but it was also the force that could tear it apart. It was the fine line between laughter and violence, between camaraderie and conflict. And, as the night wore on, and the patrons stumbled out into the cold streets, the dangers of the tavern, the risks of drinking too much, of losing control, lingered in the air long after the last mug had been drained. In the world of the medieval tavern, where chaos and camaraderie coexisted in a delicate balance, there was another force at work, one that, for all its promises of fortune and fun, often led to misery and regret. This force came not from the drink itself, but from the dice, the cards, the wagers, and the games that filled the tavern's tables late into the night. Gambling, whether it was a game of dice or cards, was as much a part of the tavern's culture as the ale and the fights. It was a way for people to test their luck, to escape the harsh realities of life, and perhaps, just perhaps, to win enough to change their fortunes. But like everything else in the tavern, gambling came with its own set of dangers, risks that were often hidden beneath the excitement of the game and the allure of easy riches. Picture the scene. You enter the tavern, the noise of conversation and laughter rising to greet you. As you make your way to the bar, your eyes are drawn to a group of men sitting at a table in the corner, their faces intense, their hands moving quickly over dice or cards. The clink of coins and the rustle of parchment fill the air, and as you watch, you realize that this is not just a friendly game. No, this is something far more serious. The stakes are high here, too high for most, but for these men, it's a way of life. The tavern is not just a place to drink away the day's worries, but a place where fortunes can be made or lost in the roll of a dice or the turn of a card. At first glance, it might seem like harmless fun, just a few men passing the time, hoping for a lucky roll or a good hand. But gambling in the tavern was far from innocent. It wasn't just about the thrill of the game. It was about survival, about holding on to whatever little wealth one could gather in a world that had little to offer in terms of security. For many tavern goers, a few coins could mean the difference between eating that night or going hungry, between having enough to buy a bed or sleeping in the streets. So, when the stakes were raised, when the games became more intense, the risks grew higher, and so did the consequences. The dice were often the most common form of gambling, their clattering sound filling the tavern late into the evening. They were cheap, easy to come by, and simple to play. But their simplicity belied the deep impact they could have on a man's life. The roll of the dice might decide who would walk away with a little extra coin, but it also decided who would walk away with nothing. Those who didn't have much to begin with were the ones who often turned to gambling, hoping to turn their luck around. But the dice didn't care who you were or what you had to lose. It was all chance, all luck or lack thereof, and many a man found himself with an empty purse and a broken heart, his last coin spent on a bet that was never won. The tension at the gambling tables was palpable, the air thick with the weight of each roll. The players sat hunched over, their eyes focused on the dice, their hearts racing with anticipation. With each roll, the tavern would fall silent for a moment, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the outcome. A win could bring cheers, laughter, and the clinking of coins, but a loss could lead to a sudden shift in the atmosphere, a heavy silence, a sigh of frustration, and sometimes even the sharp words of anger as the loser tried to hide the bitterness of defeat. The more desperate the man, the more intense the game became, and the more likely he was to wager everything he had, hoping that this one roll would change his life. But it wasn't just the dice that fueled the gambling culture of the tavern. Cards, too, were a common form of entertainment, and though they were more expensive and required a bit more skill, they could also offer the same intoxicating promise of fortune. The gambling tables became places where wagers were not just about money, but about pride, honor, and the very essence of survival in a world that demanded more than most could give. Some played for the sheer joy of the game, while others played because they had no choice. For the poor, for the laborers, for the men who worked from dawn until dusk, the tavern was a place where the games of chance might offer a glimmer of hope, however fleeting. And yet, the reality was that gambling in the tavern rarely ended well for anyone. The tables became a battleground, where a single lost bet could spell disaster. A man who had been winning for hours could suddenly find himself on the losing end, the coins slipping through his fingers as if they were nothing more than sand. The more he gambled, the more he risked losing. And for those who were already struggling to get by, the consequences of such losses were often catastrophic. There were no safety nets in the medieval tavern. There was no modern credit system to help a man pay his debts. No way to settle the score with a few clicks on a ledger or a card swipe. In the tavern, debts were paid in a far more brutal way. If a man lost his money and couldn't pay, the tavern keeper had only one option: to send the man out, often with nothing more than a warning. But not all debts could be settled so simply. If a man owed more than he could afford to lose, the consequences could be severe. Disputes would erupt, and what had begun as a friendly game could quickly spiral into a fight. Words would be exchanged, accusations of cheating would be thrown, and before long, a tavern brawl would be in full swing. Even if the fight didn't break out into violence, the loss of money and the damage to one's reputation were often enough to ruin a man. Word spread quickly in a small community, and a man who was known to be a poor gambler or a man who couldn't pay his debts would find himself ostracized. The tavern, which had once been a place for camaraderie and escape, became a reminder of a man's failure. And as the night wore on, and the patrons shuffled out into the streets, the gambler who had lost everything was left alone with nothing but the weight of his own bad decisions. Yet, even with all the risks, the gambling tables were a constant presence in the tavern. For some, it was a necessary escape from the mundane, a brief respite from the endless cycle of work and survival. For others, it was an addiction, a compulsion to risk everything for the chance of winning big. The thrill of the game, the rush of anticipation, was enough to keep the players coming back for more, even as their debts piled up and their fortunes dwindled. The tavern keeper, aware of the dangers that gambling posed, often turned a blind eye, allowing the games to continue, knowing full well that the gambling would keep the patrons coming back. After all, the more they lost, the more they would drink, and the more they drank, the more money the tavern made. But the reality of gambling in the tavern was a harsh one. It wasn't just about the loss of money, it was about the loss of control, the loss of one's dignity, and the loss of the small comforts that had made life bearable. The tavern, with its games and its promises of wealth, was a place where desperation and hope collided. For some, it was a fleeting escape, a moment of joy that didn't last. For others, it was a trap, a cycle they couldn't escape. And when the night came to an end, and the mugs were emptied, and the dice were put away, the real cost of the fun was made clear. The empty pockets, the broken promises, and the debts that couldn't be repaid. In the end, gambling in the tavern was both a source of excitement and a dangerous lure. It was a way to escape, a way to dream of a better life, but it was also a reminder of the harshness of the world outside. The tavern, for all its comforts and distractions, was a place where the high stakes of life were played out in the most unlikely of settings. The real cost of fun was often paid in ways that no one could have predicted. Step into the medieval tavern, and before you even notice the chaos unfolding around you, the laughter, the brawls, the clinking of mugs, there is one thing that strikes you, lingering in the air like an unwelcome guest: the stench. It is the smell of bodies long unwashed, of spilled ale that has fermented into something foul, and of food that has long passed its prime. The tavern is no place for the faint of heart or the sensitive of nose. The air is thick with it, the kind of stench that seeps into your clothes, into your very skin, and makes the tavern feel less like a refuge from the hardships of the outside world and more like a small corner of hell. The air is hot and heavy, filled with the smoke of burning wood from the hearth, the sour tang of sweat and unwashed flesh, and the acrid stench of spilled ale and wine that has soaked into the wooden floorboards. It's a smell that sticks to your nostrils, coating the back of your throat with each breath. Even if you were to step outside for a moment, the stench would cling to you, a reminder that you had spent even a few minutes inside this grim, suffocating space. It isn't just unpleasant, it's overpowering, a constant, insidious presence that grows stronger as you move deeper into the tavern. Imagine trying to breathe in such an environment. The windows, small and poorly maintained, let in little air. The door, when it's opened, lets in a brief gust of the night air before it swings shut again, trapping the heat and the smell inside. The poor ventilation makes the tavern a cauldron of stench, and though the fire flickers in the hearth, it does little to clear the air. In fact, the smoke from the fire only adds to the heaviness, swirling around your head like a suffocating blanket. It's a choking, cloying fog that presses in on you with every breath. You might think that the smoke from the hearth, the flickering candlelight casting shadows on the walls, would add a sense of warmth and comfort to the tavern. But the reality is far from comforting. The very air you breathe in this place is a reminder of the filth that surrounds you. The floors are covered in mud, food scraps, and discarded bones, the remnants of meals long eaten. The tavern keeper, worn out by the daily grind of keeping the ale flowing and the fights under control, can do little to keep the place tidy. The patrons, too drunk or too weary to care, pay little mind to the mess around them. After all, what is a little dirt when the ale is flowing and the night stretches on? And so, the mess piles up, the stench intensifies, and the tavern becomes less a refuge and more a grim testament to the harshness of medieval life. The smell of sweat is particularly pervasive. After all, the medieval world was a time when personal hygiene was not yet a priority. Bathing was infrequent, and the use of soap was limited to those who could afford it. Most tavern-goers, having worked hard under the sun or in the dampness of the fields, arrived in the tavern with their clothes caked in dirt, their skin grimy with sweat and oil. The air in the tavern, already thick with the smell of food and drink, was further tainted by the overpowering scent of the human body. It was the smell of hard work, of days spent under the oppressive weight of the medieval world, and it clung to the tavern like a stain that couldn't be washed away. But the true horror of the tavern's air lies in the hidden dangers that the stench masks. While you are distracted by the overwhelming smell of sweat and spilled ale, you are also inhaling the very things that could bring you harm: bacteria, germs, and other invisible threats. The unsanitary conditions that permeated the tavern were not just unpleasant, they were dangerous. The floors, thick with mud and filth, were a breeding ground for all manner of pests and diseases. Rats, mice, fleas, and lice, these creatures thrived in the mess, feeding on the scraps and waste that piled up on the floor. The rats, in particular, were a constant presence in the tavern, scurrying in and out of the shadows, their tiny claws clicking against the wood. But it wasn't just the vermin that posed a risk. It was the bacteria and pathogens that they carried with them. The very air you breathed in that crowded, fetid space was filled with the invisible threats that could leave you sick or worse, dead. But even without the vermin and disease, the smell of the tavern had a profound psychological effect on those who spent any length of time within its walls. The tavern was a place where the harshness of life was felt at its most visceral, where the discomforts of daily existence were laid bare in the smell of sweat, food, and drink. It was a place where the very air you breathed seemed to reinforce the notion that life was dirty, that survival was messy, and that comfort was a luxury few could afford. The stench in the tavern was not just an inconvenience. It was a reminder of the unforgiving world outside, a world where there was little space for beauty, for cleanliness, or for anything that resembled comfort. And yet, in the midst of it all, the tavern-goers learned to adapt. The stench, the filth, the discomfort, they were part of the package, part of the experience of life in the medieval world. It was a grim acceptance, a resignation to the fact that this was simply how things were. There was no escaping the smell, no retreat to a cleaner space where the air was fresh and the atmosphere was warm and welcoming. The tavern was a reflection of the world outside, harsh, unforgiving, and constantly reminding you that survival was the only thing that mattered. And so, the patrons drank, they laughed, they gambled, and they fought, all while breathing in the stench that filled the room. It became a part of them, like the dirt on their hands, like the sweat on their brows, a constant presence that they had no choice but to endure. The tavern keeper, too, had to live with the stench. They had no choice but to accept it, to work through it, to maintain the tavern despite the oppressive smell that hung in the air. The tavern keeper's job was not just about serving drinks and keeping the peace, it was about maintaining an atmosphere, however unpleasant, that could keep the customers coming back. They might not have been able to improve the conditions of the tavern, but they could control the flow of ale, the quality of service, and the order of the room. The tavern keeper, much like the patrons, learned to accept the stench, to make it part of the experience, to turn it into something almost normal. It was their job to keep the tavern running, and if that meant enduring the unbearable smell, so be it. In many ways, the stench of the tavern was a symbol of everything that the medieval world represented. It was a world where survival often meant tolerating discomfort, where the harshness of life could not be escaped, and where the simple act of breathing became a reminder of the hardships that surrounded you. The tavern, with its stifling air and oppressive smell, was a microcosm of the medieval experience, a place where the mess of life was not hidden, but embraced, The stench was as much a part of the experience as the drinks and the laughter, and in a way, it made the tavern what it was. Without the smell, the tavern would have been something else entirely, something far more comfortable and far less real. As the night wore on and the tavern grew emptier, the stench lingered in the air, a reminder of the day's events and the long night that still stretched ahead. The fire flickered low, casting long shadows across the floor, and the last few patrons stumbled out into the cold night, leaving behind the smell of sweat, spilt ale, and the remnants of a long, chaotic evening. The tavern, for all its discomforts, had served its purpose. It had provided a space for survival, for escape, and for a brief respite from the hardships of the world. But as the door creaked shut behind the last of the revelers, the smell remained, hanging in the air like a memory of all that had transpired within those walls. In the medieval tavern, where the air was thick with the smell of sweat, spilled ale, and unwashed bodies, where the flickering candlelight barely illuminated the rough-hewn tables, there was one thing that could always be counted on: the unpredictability of the culture that thrived within those walls. The tavern, for all its faults, was a space where society's tensions, frustrations, and desires came to a head, where the rawness of human behavior was on full display. It was a space where anything could happen, and often it did. And while some might have walked into the tavern expecting camaraderie or a warm drink, many left with nothing more than bruised egos, broken friendships, or worse, bloody noses. The tavern was a volatile mix of people from all walks of life: farmers, craftsmen, soldiers, nobles, travelers, each with their own motives, desires, and stories. They came for the same reason: to drink, to relax, to forget the troubles of the outside world, or simply to survive another night in a harsh and unpredictable world. But while some came with light hearts, hoping to share a laugh or make a new friend, others came with an edge, ready to challenge anyone who might look at them the wrong way or question their pride. The tavern, with its promise of anonymity and release, was the perfect place to let go of societal norms, and often the violence and disorder that came from this cultural chaos were the inevitable results. The patrons of the tavern, drunk and unburdened by the rules of the outside world, often found themselves testing boundaries, not just in words, but in actions. A joke turned sour, a casual remark misinterpreted, a bump in the shoulder on the crowded floor, each was a potential spark capable of igniting a brawl in an instant. The tension in the tavern was palpable, a feeling in the air that you could almost taste. It wasn't always about what was said, but about how it was received, how each movement and gesture carried with it an unspoken challenge, a threat waiting to be realized. You could see it in the way the men looked at each other, sizing one another up as they drank. A glance here, a slight movement there, small signals that only the trained eye could detect. And while the tavern keeper might have been able to silence the loudest of voices or break up a scuffle or two, they were always aware that things could escalate in an instant. The rules of the tavern were simple: drink, play, fight, and then leave. But it was never that simple. The games played at the tables, whether dice or cards, were not just for amusement. They were a way to prove dominance, to show that one was stronger, more clever, more deserving of respect. Gambling, in the medieval tavern, was about more than just money. It was about power. And when the stakes were high, tempers flared. The unpredictability of the tavern culture also extended to the behavior of the patrons. Men and women alike could be swept up in the wild, uninhibited atmosphere, and the atmosphere itself would often take on a life of its own. Alcohol, after all, has a way of loosening tongues and lowering inhibitions. One moment, two men might be laughing over a shared joke, and the next, they would be at each other's throats, fists flying in the air, driven by the belief that they had been insulted or wronged in some way. And then, there were the women often overlooked in the chaos of the tavern, yet just as affected by the culture of unpredictability. The few women who frequented the tavern, whether as customers or as barmaids, faced a dangerous world of their own. Drunken advances were a common occurrence, and even a brief accidental touch could lead to an explosion of anger, a duel of words or fists over an insult or a misunderstanding. While much of the tavern's danger was physical, much of it also stemmed from the sense of powerlessness it instilled in its patrons. After all, the tavern was often a refuge for those who had nothing to lose. The poorest and most desperate came to the tavern for solace, to escape from the harshness of life, and often to forget the suffering that awaited them once they left. But in a place like the tavern, where survival meant adapting to the ever-shifting social dynamics, it wasn't long before desperation turned into recklessness. The regular patrons, often aware of the precariousness of their position, would find themselves caught in a constant struggle for control, for respect, and for self-preservation. When you have nothing to lose, your actions become unpredictable. And that unpredictability, when combined with the intoxication of alcohol, could turn a calm evening into a full-blown crisis. The sense of uncertainty in the tavern created an atmosphere where alliances were fluid and loyalty was hard to come by. In one moment, you might be sharing a drink with a fellow patron, laughing at a shared joke, and in the next, find yourself facing that very same person in a fight, their eyes filled with a mix of rage and betrayal. Nothing in the tavern was permanent. Friendships, like alliances, were temporary, built on the fleeting pleasures of drink and conversation, and easily shattered by the smallest of provocations. A drunken insult, a bad roll of the dice, or an unwelcome touch each could serve as a trigger for an unpredictable outburst that would shake the very foundation of the tavern. In a place where rules were few and respect was earned through strength rather than civility, it didn't take much to incite conflict. A challenge could be issued over the simplest of things: who could drink more, who had the better hand at cards, who had the loudest laugh. Some came to the tavern simply to test their limits, to see if they could provoke someone into a fight, to see if they could stand their ground in a world that had no mercy for the weak. And when the fight inevitably broke out, it would be the tavern itself that bore the consequences. The broken tables, the spilled ale, the shattered mugs, all remnants of the same chaos that had brought the patrons together in the first place. Even the tavern keeper, despite their authority, was not immune to the unpredictability of tavern culture. They were the ones who had to manage the fallout of every fight, every quarrel, every drunken altercation. The tavern keeper was often forced to decide who stayed and who was thrown out, who was worthy of a drink and who had lost the right to one. The role of the tavern keeper was more than just service. It was about maintaining the delicate balance between chaos and control, keeping the peace just long enough to make a profit before the next eruption of violence threatened to tear the place apart. As the night wore on and the alcohol continued to flow, the unpredictability of the tavern culture only grew. The drunken games of chance gave way to drunken games of violence, and the laughter that once filled the air turned into angry shouts and insults. It was in the tavern, in those moments of wildness, that the true nature of medieval life was revealed: a world where nothing was guaranteed, where survival depended on wit, strength, and a willingness to navigate the dangerous unpredictability of life. For many, the tavern was a place of escape, a place where they could forget their hardships, if only for a few hours. But for others, it was a reminder of how quickly things could go wrong, how quickly the line between camaraderie and violence could be crossed. The tavern's chaotic nature, though it offered temporary relief, was also a reflection of the harshness of the world outside. It was a place where the rules of civility could be abandoned, where the rawness of human behavior was laid bare, and where every sip of ale, every roll of the dice, and every word spoken was a gamble, one that could change the course of the evening, and sometimes a man's life. The medieval tavern, with its warmth, its camaraderie, and its seemingly endless supply of ale, was not just a place for relaxation and escape, it was also a breeding ground for danger. Behind the laughter, the games, and the brawls, there was a much darker reality lurking beneath the surface, one that was invisible yet deadly. The diseases that spread within the tavern walls were as much a part of the experience as the drunken revelry. For those who spent too much time within the tavern's dark, musty walls, the risks of illness were as certain as the next drink being poured. In a time before modern medicine, when understanding of hygiene was primitive at best, disease spread easily through the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions of the medieval tavern. The very air you breathed in these dark, dank spaces was thick with the invisible pathogens that could make you ill. The tavern, with its poorly ventilated rooms and grimy floors, was a place where the risk of infection was constant, and where survival depended not just on luck, but on the immune system's ability to ward off the dangers lurking in every corner. The floors, covered in muck, food scraps, and human waste, were a breeding ground for bacteria. Every corner of the tavern was filled with filth, and it wasn't just the rats and vermin that posed a risk, it was the very air that you breathed. A tavern patron might sit down at a table, feeling the warmth of the fire against their back and the comforting weight of their mug in their hands. But what they couldn't see was the invisible army of germs swirling in the air, waiting to latch onto their skin, their food, their drink. The unsanitary conditions meant that diseases spread quickly, making the tavern a prime site for infection. The lack of basic sanitation meant that diseases like cholera, dysentery, and tuberculosis were not just threats, they were a daily reality. Cholera, a deadly waterborne disease caused by contaminated food and drink, was one of the most common and most feared illnesses in medieval times. The tavern, with its poor food handling and questionable water sources, was an ideal place for the bacteria to spread. The water used in the preparation of food, the cleaning of dishes, and the brewing of ale was often tainted, and with little understanding of germs or disease transmission, patrons would unknowingly ingest the bacteria, leading to outbreaks that could wipe out entire communities. Cholera was known for its sudden onset, causing vomiting, diarrhea, and severe dehydration, and it could be deadly within hours if left untreated. In the confined, overcrowded space of the tavern, cholera could spread quickly, passed from one patron to the next as they drank from the same mugs, shared food, or sat too close to one another. But cholera was far from the only disease that could strike down a tavern-goer. Dysentery, a disease caused by bacterial infection in the intestines, was another common and highly contagious affliction. In the unsanitary conditions of the tavern, where chamber pots were used indoors and the floors were covered in human waste, the risk of dysentery was ever present. The bacteria that caused dysentery spread through contaminated food or water, and because the tavern's food was often of poor quality and frequently left out for long periods, it provided a perfect breeding ground for infection. Those who contracted dysentery would suffer from painful stomach cramps, vomiting, and diarrhea, making the disease not only dangerous but debilitating. The tavern's lack of proper hygiene meant that patrons, without even realizing it, were at constant risk of illness. Another disease that was rampant in the tavern was tuberculosis, TB. A disease of the lungs, TB was spread through the air when an infected person coughed or sneezed. In the close quarters of the tavern, with its crowded tables and constant movement, the disease could spread rapidly. TB often went unnoticed for months or even years, as the symptoms coughing, fever, and fatigue could easily be dismissed as a simple cold or illness. But once it took hold, tuberculosis could be deadly, especially in a time when antibiotics were unknown and treatment was limited to rest and isolation. The tavern, where people were packed together in proximity, was a perfect breeding ground for the spread of TB, and those who frequented the tavern were at a constant risk of infection. The smoke-filled air, the poor ventilation, and the crowded conditions all contributed to the rapid spread of the disease. But even diseases that weren't as deadly, like the common cold or influenza, could wreak havoc in the tavern. In a world where medicine was rudimentary, and most people had no concept of how diseases spread, a simple cough or sneeze could be enough to infect dozens of people in a matter of hours. The tavern's lack of hygiene made it impossible to contain even the most mundane illnesses, and with patrons coming and going, it wasn't long before the entire tavern could be affected by whatever sickness had made its way in. The combination of poor hygiene, overcrowding, and a lack of understanding about the spread of disease meant that the tavern was often a hotbed of illness. In a world without effective health care or medicine, the tavern-goers were left to rely on their body's natural defenses to fight off the constant barrage of diseases. But for many, those defenses were not enough. Young children, the elderly, and the sickly were particularly vulnerable, and those who spent too much time in the tavern were at constant risk of contracting something that could spell their demise. Even the healthiest of patrons weren't immune to the long-term effects of the tavern's disease-ridden atmosphere. Prolonged exposure to the filth and bacteria of the tavern could weaken a person's immune system, making them more susceptible to illnesses. The lack of nutrition, the poor quality food, and the constant exposure to germs left patrons in a weakened state, even if they didn't immediately fall ill. It wasn't uncommon for a regular tavern-goer to catch one illness after another, slowly becoming weaker with each new infection, until their body could no longer fight off the diseases that plagued them. But it wasn't just the diseases that could kill a person, it was also the long-term effects of living in such an unhealthy environment. The poor hygiene of the tavern, the lack of sanitation, and the constant exposure to bacteria took a toll on the body, weakening the immune system and making it harder for the body to fight off infection. Even if a person managed to survive a bout of cholera or dysentery, the toll it took on their body left them vulnerable to future illnesses. And in a world without effective medical treatment, many never recovered fully from these illnesses. They lived on in a constant state of weakness, always at the mercy of the next disease that would inevitably come their way. As the night wore on and the tavern grew louder and more crowded, the dangers of illness remained ever present. Patrons continued to drink, gamble, and socialize, oblivious to the invisible threats that surrounded them. The tavern keeper, burdened with managing the chaos of the evening, had little time to worry about the diseases that could spread so easily within the walls. The lack of proper sanitation was simply part of life, and survival in the tavern meant accepting the risks that came with it. And yet, for all its dangers, the tavern remained a central part of medieval life. It was a place to escape, to forget the hardships of the day, even if only for a few hours. But in the end, the tavern was just as much a place of sickness as it was a place of relief. The very air you breathed, the very food you ate, were laced with the hidden dangers that would make you sick, and for some, it would be a danger they could not outrun. In the dark, cramped corners of the medieval tavern, where the clinking of mugs and the raucous laughter of drunken patrons filled the air, another force loomed, a shadow that stretched far beyond the flickering candlelight. The church, with its moral authority and its strict code of conduct, saw the tavern not as a place of merriment, but as a breeding ground for sin and vice. The tavern, after all, was where the boundaries of acceptable behavior were most frequently tested, and where the struggles between faith and earthly desire played out in real time. The tavern was a place where the rules of polite society and Christian morality were, at best, ignored, and at worst, openly defied. Alcohol flowed freely, fueling conversations that often drifted into blasphemous territory, or worse, degenerating into full-blown drunken brawls. The tavern-goers, whether they were peasants or nobles, were more likely to seek refuge from their troubles in the bottom of a tankard than in prayer. For many, the tavern was the one place where they could temporarily escape the burden of religious dogma and the expectations of society. Here, they could indulge in their earthly desires without fear of judgment, forgetting for a few hours the weight of their sins and the endless pursuit of salvation. But the church, ever vigilant, was not so easily silenced. Clergy across the land condemned the tavern's hedonistic culture, viewing it as a direct threat to the moral fabric of society. Drunkenness, gambling, promiscuity, these were all seen as sins, and the tavern, with its unrestrained behaviors, was a place where those sins were both celebrated and encouraged. The church preached that the tavern was a temptation to be resisted, a place where the faithful could easily fall into vice and lose their souls. The tavern keeper, for all their authority within the tavern walls, had little influence over the more spiritual concerns of their patrons. The true authority rested with the priests and bishops who held sway over the town's moral compass. The church's influence over the tavern was, however, a complex one. While the church preached against drunkenness and immorality, it also recognized the tavern as an essential part of medieval life. After all, the tavern was not just a place of sin, it was also a place of socialization, commerce, and even relief for weary travelers. It was a space where people came together to discuss matters of business, politics, and daily life. And it was often the only place where the working class could afford to meet and enjoy themselves, however fleetingly. In many ways, the tavern was a necessary evil, a space that both nurtured vice and provided a place for communal interaction. The church, while seeking to eliminate the excesses of tavern life, could not entirely remove the need for it. Clergy members were well aware of this contradiction, and it led to a series of uneasy interactions between the church and the tavern. In some cases, local priests would look the other way when their flock indulged in a drink or a game of dice. In other cases, however, the church took direct action, organizing sermons that condemned the tavern's activities and preached against the temptations of drink and gambling. On religious holidays or during fasting periods, the tavern was particularly scrutinized, as the church urged people to avoid indulgence and seek solace in prayer rather than in the arms of earthly pleasures. This tension between the tavern's permissiveness and the church's restrictions created a constant back and forth, where the tavern keeper, the priests, and the patrons found themselves navigating a world of moral contradictions. One of the most effective tools the church had at its disposal was the power of excommunication. For those whose behavior in the tavern was particularly egregious, those who drank too much, gambled excessively, or broke the moral code in other ways, the church could use the threat of excommunication as a way to enforce its authority. Excommunication, in the medieval world, was a powerful punishment. To be cut off from the church was to be cut off from society itself. It meant that one could not partake in the sacraments, could not receive absolution for their sins, and was effectively ostracized from the community. For the devout medieval peasant, there was no greater punishment than to be excommunicated, and so the church's moral teachings carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. However, as much as the church tried to curb the tavern culture, it was not always successful. Many tavern-goers, drunk on their ale, would laugh at the priest's warnings, dismissing them as the concerns of a distant authority. For the working-class patrons, who made up the bulk of tavern-goers, the teachings of the church often seemed distant, abstract, and irrelevant. They were more concerned with the immediacy of their lives getting through another hard day of labor, finding warmth in the tavern's fire, and enjoying a drink to ease the burden of their toil. For these patrons, the tavern was more of a sanctuary from the rigid expectations of church doctrine than a place where their behavior would be scrutinized. Still, the church made its presence felt in the tavern through its occasional interventions and its emphasis on moral conduct. There were times when local priests would march into the tavern with a few stern words and a reminder of the moral expectations of the village. In some towns, it was customary for the church to maintain a stronghold in the tavern itself, sometimes even presiding over the moral conduct of the tavern keeper, ensuring that the establishment didn't descend too far into debauchery. But the very existence of the tavern, the idea that people could come together, drink, gamble, and let loose, was a challenge to the church's authority, and many saw it as a threat to the discipline and piety that they preached. The tavern keeper, caught between the demands of their patrons and the moral strictures of the church, was often in a difficult position. On one hand, they had to ensure that their business remained profitable, that the ale flowed freely, and that the patrons remained entertained and satisfied. On the other hand, they were aware that the church could take action against them if their tavern became a haven for sin. If the tavern was seen as a place where drinking was excessive, where gambling ran wild, or where immoral behavior was tolerated, the church could take steps to close it down, or at the very least, force the tavern keeper to toe the line. Tavern keepers often had to walk a tightrope, maintaining a careful balance between satisfying their customers' desires and keeping the clergy at bay. But despite the efforts of the church to exert control over tavern life, there was one thing they could not escape: the human desire for escape and enjoyment. For all of the church's teachings and moral guidelines, there was something deeply ingrained in human nature: the need to let go, to drink, to indulge, and to experience pleasure, however fleeting. The tavern was where that desire found its most unfiltered expression, and no matter how much the church preached against it, the tavern remained an essential part of medieval life. It was a place where people could forget their worries, their sins, and their responsibilities, even if only for a few hours. And it was that sense of freedom, that sense of release from the strictures of daily life, that made the tavern such a vital, albeit dangerous, space. In many ways, the struggle between the church's influence and the tavern's culture was a reflection of the broader tension between faith and earthly desires in medieval society. The church's teachings were meant to keep people on the straight and narrow, to remind them of their duties as Christians. But the tavern represented the primal need for freedom and enjoyment. The clash between these two forces created a complex and often contradictory environment, where patrons came for both spiritual refuge and earthly indulgence. The church might try to condemn the tavern as a den of sin, but for many medieval people, the tavern was the only space where they could find a moment of respite from the struggles of life, a place where, for all its moral dangers, they could feel alive. Despite the tavern's reputation as a place of disorder, danger, and debauchery, there was, beneath it all, an undeniable appeal. In the midst of its filth, its noise, and its unpredictable culture, the tavern offered something rare and precious in the medieval world: a brief escape. It was a place where one could forget the crushing weight of daily life, if only for a few hours. A place where the boundaries of society could be temporarily set aside, where the hardships of work, war, and hunger could be pushed to the background, where the common person could find, however fleetingly, a sense of camaraderie and relief. Picture yourself entering the tavern after a long day in the fields or a tiresome journey through the unforgiving medieval landscape. You are weary, your body aching from the labor of the day, your stomach empty and growling. The world outside has been harsh, unyielding, but inside the tavern, there is a different rhythm, a different pace. The air is thick with the smell of roasting meat, the warmth of the fire offers a reprieve from the cold, and the sound of mugs clinking together fills the room, a simple, welcoming melody. It's a place where, for a moment, you can leave your troubles behind. For the common folk, the tavern was often the only space where they could feel a sense of freedom, of indulgence, even if just for a short while. It was a temporary respite from the grinding poverty, the back-breaking labor, and the constant anxiety of survival. The tavern offered the luxury of relaxation, however short-lived. The promise of warmth, of a drink, and of some momentary pleasure was enough to draw people in, even as they knew that the world outside would still await them once they left. In the flickering candlelight of the tavern, the harshness of their lives seemed distant, as though the tavern existed in a world apart, a bubble of light and heat amidst the darkness of reality. For a moment, the tavern-goers could forget their struggles. They could escape the constant weight of hunger, the demands of work, and the oppressive grip of society. The drinking games, the laughter, the shared stories, all of these became a way to bond, to share in something greater than the sum of individual lives. It was here, in the tavern, that the common folk found a fleeting sense of community. The drink that flowed so freely helped to erase the lines of class, if only temporarily. The farmer sat beside the merchant, the soldier beside the blacksmith, and for a while, at least everyone was equal under the low ceiling and dim light. It was a brief moment of equality in a world where such things were scarce. But even in the midst of these moments of escape, there was always a sense of impermanence. The tavern, for all its warmth and camaraderie, could not shield its patrons from the inevitable return to the harsh realities of life. Once the ale was gone and the laughter faded, the troubles of the world outside would return with full force. The men who had been drinking together as equals would return to their respective stations in life: farmer, noble, tradesman, soldier, and the walls of the tavern would once again become a barrier, not a bridge. Still, for those few hours, the tavern provided something precious, a chance to escape the monotony of labor, the tension of politics, and the weight of an unforgiving world. It offered relief in a way that nothing else could. A temporary sanctuary where the chaos of life could be drowned in drink, laughter, and games. But it was a temporary escape, a momentary relief. As the night grew late, and the mugs emptied, and the fires burned lower, the sense of respite began to slip away. The lights would dim, the noise would fade, and the patrons would begin to stumble toward the door, their minds fogged not just by drink, but by the fleeting sense of freedom they had tasted. The tavern offered solace in a world where peace was scarce. It was a place where, despite its flaws and its chaos, people came together to share in something simple and human. For a brief moment, the burdens of life seemed to fade, replaced by the warmth of the fire, the sound of a song, and the comfort of a shared drink. It was not much, but it was enough. Enough to keep people coming back, night after night, seeking that same brief relief. The tavern, despite all its dangers, offered a kind of salvation, not in the form of prayers or absolution, but in the form of temporary peace, a fleeting escape from the trials of the world outside. The physical comforts of the tavern, while basic, were more than enough to provide a sense of relief. The warm food, the drink, the shelter from the cold, it all contributed to a sense of temporary comfort. The fire in the hearth was more than just a source of heat. It was a symbol of the warmth that the tavern goers sought, a symbol of safety in a world that often lacked it. The ale, which flowed so freely, was not just a drink. It was a balm for the soul, a way to dull the sharp edges of life's hardships. And the food, though often stale and unappetizing, was still sustenance, providing enough to quiet the hunger that gnawed at the stomach. For many, the tavern was a place where time seemed to slow down. Outside, the world moved quickly, seasons changed, fields were plowed and harvested, the wars raged on, and life seemed to be a never-ending cycle of toil and struggle. But inside the tavern, time was suspended. There was no clock, no deadlines, no sense of urgency. It was a place where the moment was all that mattered, where the present was allowed to take center stage. The drinking, the talking, the laughter, everything in the tavern moved at its own pace, detached from the world outside. But this escape came with its own set of complications. The tavern-goers, despite the temporary relief they found within, were also confronted with their own addictions, their own desires. The tavern, for all its moments of respite, also fostered the darker sides of human nature. The very indulgence that offered temporary comfort also led to excess, to overindulgence, to loss of control. The drink that dulled the pain could also become a trap, ensnaring the very people it sought to help. The tavern-goers, who came seeking solace, often left with more than just a foggy head, and a few coins spent they left with the weight of their vices, their excesses, and their forgotten promises. Yet, for all its dangers, the tavern remained a necessary part of life in the medieval world. It was a place where people could find temporary relief, where the harshness of their lives could be forgotten, even if just for a moment. The tavern was more than just a physical space. It was a space where the human need for companionship, escape, and indulgence was fulfilled. It was a reflection of the world itself, full of contradictions, excesses, and brief moments of peace. For all its flaws, the tavern provided something that could not be easily found elsewhere: a sense of belonging, of community, of release. It was a place where the weight of the world could be lifted, if only for a short while. And in that fleeting moment of escape, the tavern-goers found what they needed most: comfort, companionship, and the hope that, no matter how brief, they could forget the struggles of life outside its walls. As the fire dimmed, the mugs emptied, and the patrons stumbled out into the cold night, they knew that the moment had passed, but that it would come again. The tavern, despite all its flaws, would remain. And so, they would return again and again, seeking the warmth, the relief, and the brief escape it offered. As we bring our journey through the medieval tavern to a close, we begin to understand just how much these places were more than mere drinking holes. The tavern was a crucible of life, where survival wasn't simply about avoiding fights or staying sober. In fact, it was much more complicated than that. In these places, staying alive often meant enduring filth, navigating dangers, and surviving the constant threat of illness. Taverns weren't the cozy retreat we might imagine today, where a quiet pint is enjoyed by the fire. Instead, they were rough, chaotic spaces where one's wits and strength were just as important as one's will to survive. Taverns, in medieval times, served as focal points of society, blending the poor, the working class, and even the occasional noble into one volatile mix. In these places, class divisions were plainly visible, and social norms were constantly tested. There, a peasant could sit beside a knight, and while they might share a drink, the gap between them was evident, not only in their position in society but in the way they interacted with the space itself. For the nobility, the tavern was often a place to forget their duties and escape the rigid expectations of court life. But for the common folk, it was a place of survival, where a drink or a game could be the difference between making it through the night or losing everything. But in the medieval tavern, survival went beyond just getting a meal. It was about navigating a world fraught with risks, where the threat of violence, disease, and the harsh realities of medieval life loomed large. To make it out of a tavern unscathed was a victory in itself, for the dangers inside were often just as deadly as the dangers outside. Every night spent in a medieval tavern was a roll of the dice, a chance at survival in a world that was unforgiving to the unprepared or the weak. Taverns may have provided an escape, a place for the weary to rest, to share stories, or even to momentarily forget about the grinding hardships of daily life. But they were also fraught with risks, diseases, fights, the constant specter of violence, and a general discomfort that permeated the very walls. The warmth of the fire and the sound of laughter often had to contend with the looming threat of disease, violence, and other dangers that made these places not just hubs of camaraderie, but survival zones in their own right. In the grand scheme of medieval life, taverns were a microcosm, a reflection of the society they were built in. Chaotic, dangerous, and far from glamorous, but necessary. These were places that, despite all their discomforts, became essential to the rhythm of life. They were one of the few places where people from all walks of life could meet, share, fight, and survive together. So, as you settle into bed tonight, consider the strange yet essential role these taverns played in the medieval world. Picture yourself walking through their noisy, smoky rooms, feeling the heat of the fire and the bite of the cold air outside, hearing the distant clash of dice and the laughter of strangers. And maybe, just maybe, you'll understand the unique blend of chaos, camaraderie, and danger that kept these places alive and kept those who entered them just a little more alive as well. If this journey into the past has piqued your curiosity, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales from a time of rough edges and strange customs. Let me know in the comments below what you'd like to learn about next. Would you survive in a medieval tavern, or would you find yourself lost in the chaos? Until then, drift off into sleep, where history breathes softly in the dark.